October 1978. A grey morning in Birmingham, England. 71-year-old Jean Harper stood in her front garden watching two council workers carry boxes out of a house that was never supposed to exist anymore. The walls were corroding. The roof leaked whenever it rained. The electrical wiring had been condemned years earlier. One council official, trying to be reassuring, told her she was finally getting a proper house. Jean didn't answer. She simply looked back at the small bungalow she had called home for more than 3 decades. The house she was leaving had been designed to last 10 years. She had lived in it for 32. That moment, a pensioner standing quietly outside a crumbling prefab home in 1978, is where this story begins. But it isn't where it starts. Because to understand why Jean Harper was reluctant to leave a house that experts had spent years declaring obsolete, we have to go back to a Britain that barely existed anymore. A Britain of bomb craters, of ration books, of ruined streets, of millions of people waiting for a home that wasn't there. And we have to go back to a decision made by a government facing one of the greatest housing disasters in modern European history. A decision that would create entire communities, raise hundreds of thousands of children, and leave behind some of the most beloved temporary homes ever built. The story of Britain's prefab houses is often told as a story of emergency housing. That description is accurate. It is also completely inadequate, because these houses were never just buildings. For an entire generation of British families, they became something much more important. They became the place where life started again. The Second World War ended in Europe in May 1945. The celebrations were enormous. Church bells rang. Crowds filled the streets. Flags appeared from windows that had survived 6 years of war. Across the country, people embraced strangers. The nightmare was over. Or at least that was how it appeared. The reality was considerably more complicated. Victory had solved one problem. It had exposed another. Britain had won the war, but much of Britain had been damaged in the process. Years of German bombing had left entire neighborhoods shattered. Cities such as London, Coventry, Liverpool, Plymouth, Portsmouth, and Birmingham carried scars that would remain visible for decades. More than 3 million homes had been destroyed or seriously damaged. Entire streets had disappeared. Families who once lived in ordinary houses now occupied overcrowded rooms, temporary shelters, converted military buildings, or the spare bedrooms of relatives who had little space to spare themselves. And then came another challenge. Millions of servicemen were coming home. Men who had spent years fighting across North Africa, Italy, France, Germany, and countless other battlefields were returning with expectations that seemed entirely reasonable. They wanted jobs. They wanted families. And they wanted somewhere to live. The government quickly realized that housing was becoming a national emergency. Every week that passed increased the pressure. Young couples postponed marriage because they had nowhere to move. Parents raised children in overcrowded conditions. Returning veterans found themselves competing for homes that simply did not exist. The waiting lists grew longer. The frustration grew louder. And the government knew something dangerous. People could tolerate hardship during a war. They were far less willing to tolerate it after victory. Officials began searching for solutions. Traditional construction could not build houses fast enough. There were shortages of bricks, shortages of timber, shortages of skilled labor, shortages of almost everything. Britain had won the largest war in its history. Now it faced the challenge of rebuilding itself with exhausted resources and an exhausted economy. The numbers were overwhelming. Hundreds of thousands of homes were needed immediately. Not eventually. Not within a decade. Now. And it was during this search for answers that someone proposed an idea that sounded almost absurd. What if houses were built the same way Britain had built aircraft? Not one at a time. Not slowly. Not on traditional building sites. But in factories. Mass-produced. Standardized. Shipped across the country in pieces. And assembled in days. The idea seemed radical. But wartime Britain had already become very good at mass production. Factories that had spent years manufacturing bombers, fighters, and military equipment possessed something invaluable. Experience. Machinery. Workers. Production lines. The government looked at those factories and saw something unexpected. It saw houses. Not permanent houses. No one imagined that. The plan was much more modest. Build temporary homes. Simple homes. Quick homes. Homes that could shelter families until proper housing could be constructed. 10 years. That was roughly the intended lifespan. A decade. Long enough for Britain to recover. Long enough for conventional construction to catch up. Long enough to solve the crisis. At least, that was the theory. What nobody realized was that these temporary homes were about to become the backdrop for some of the most important years in British family life. Children would grow up inside them. Veterans would start families inside them. Communities would form around them. And decades later, when officials arrived to remove them, many residents would react the same way Jean Harper did in 1978. Not with relief, but with heartbreak. Because the government believed it was building emergency housing. What it actually built was something far more powerful. And the first prefab houses were about to begin arriving across Britain. The first prefab houses began arriving in Britain in late 1945. To the people unloading them from trucks, they looked less like homes and more like oversized construction kits. Panels, frames, roof sections, doors, windows. Everything arrived separately. Everything had been manufactured somewhere else. And everything had been designed around a single idea. Speed. Britain did not have the luxury of waiting. Every month thousands of families remained trapped in overcrowded conditions. Entire households shared a single room. Children slept on folding beds. Parents lived with grandparents. Newly married couples often found themselves living under the roofs of relatives because there was simply nowhere else to go. For many families, privacy had become a forgotten concept. The government understood something important. Housing was no longer just a construction problem. It was becoming a social problem, a political problem, potentially even a national morale problem. The war had been won with promises of a better future. Now people expected that future to arrive. And they expected it soon. In March 1944, even before the war had ended, Prime Minister had announced an ambitious plan. Britain would build hundreds of thousands of temporary prefabricated homes. The public quickly became familiar with a new word. Prefab, short for prefabricated house. It sounded industrial, practical, temporary. Nobody imagined it would become one of the most beloved forms of housing in modern British history. Government planners envisioned something simple. Each family would receive a modest bungalow. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, a living room, a bathroom. Nothing luxurious. Nothing permanent. Just enough to bridge the gap until traditional housing could be built. The remarkable part was how they intended to construct them. Many of the companies involved had spent years producing military equipment. Some had manufactured aircraft. Others had built components for tanks, ships, and wartime infrastructure. The skills developed during total war were now being redirected toward peace. Factories that once produced machines for destruction would produce homes instead. There was something poetic about that transformation. The same industrial system that had helped Britain survive the war was now being asked to help Britain recover from it. And for a brief moment, it worked remarkably well. One of the most famous designs was the Aero Prefab. Its name came from the aircraft industry's research organization on housing. Even the name revealed its origins. These houses were, in many ways, aircraft engineering applied to everyday life. Aluminium panels formed much of the structure. Components were manufactured with precision. Every piece was designed to fit together efficiently. Workers could assemble an entire house in a matter of days. To modern audiences, that might not sound extraordinary. In 1945, it was revolutionary. Traditional houses could take months to complete. A prefab could appear almost overnight. Families waiting on housing lists often watched empty plots of land transform into neighborhoods within weeks. Roads appeared. Foundations were laid. Trucks arrived. Then suddenly there were houses where none had existed before. For people desperate for somewhere to live, it felt almost miraculous. Yet government officials remained cautious. The prefabs were always described as temporary. Reports emphasized their limited lifespan. Engineers estimated around 10 years of service. Maybe a little longer if properly maintained. No one expected them to survive beyond the 1950s. After all, these structures had been created during a period of shortages. Materials were limited. Budgets were constrained. Speed mattered more than permanence. The assumptions seemed perfectly reasonable. But assumptions have a habit of colliding with reality. And reality arrived the moment families began moving in. Because the people designing these houses had unintentionally created something unusual. Compared with much of the housing stock available to working-class families at the time, prefabs were surprisingly comfortable. Many residents encountered conveniences they had never possessed before. There were indoor bathrooms. There was running hot water. There were fitted kitchens. There were refrigerators in some units. Large windows allowed sunlight to flood the rooms. Small gardens surrounded many properties. For a generation accustomed to cramped Victorian housing and wartime austerity, these features felt astonishingly modern. One woman would later recall entering her prefab for the first time and feeling as though she had stepped into the future. Another remembered being amazed that every room seemed bright. Not dark. Not overcrowded. Bright. That detail appears repeatedly in survivor interviews. Light. Space. Things many people take for granted today were deeply meaningful in post-war Britain. Children who had spent years sharing bedrooms suddenly had room to themselves. Parents gained privacy. Families gained independence. For many residents, the prefab represented more than shelter. It represented dignity. That emotional impact is difficult to measure in statistics. Government reports counted units built. Engineers tracked maintenance costs. Politicians debated budgets. But families experienced something entirely different. They experienced relief. After years of war, uncertainty, and overcrowding, they finally had a place they could call their own. And as more prefab estates appeared across Britain, something unexpected began happening. The government had intended to solve a housing crisis. Instead, it was creating communities. Entire neighborhoods filled with young families emerged almost simultaneously. Children of similar ages. Parents facing similar challenges. Veterans adjusting to civilian life. People who had survived the same war and now found themselves building the same future. The houses may have been temporary. The relationships forming inside them would prove far more durable. And in the years ahead, those communities would transform rows of prefabricated bungalows into something no government planner had anticipated. They would transform them into home. By the early 1950s, many of Britain's prefab estates had settled into a rhythm of daily life. From above, they looked unremarkable. Rows of nearly identical bungalows. Small gardens. Narrow footpaths. Children's bicycles leaning against fences. Laundry drying in back gardens. Nothing about them suggested they were part of one of the most ambitious emergency housing programs in British history. And yet, for the people living there, these estates felt like entire worlds. Every morning began the same way. Factory workers left for early shifts. Bus drivers headed into town. Former servicemen put on work clothes instead of uniforms. Children gathered outside before school. Mothers chatted over garden fences. Life, which had been interrupted by 6 years of war, slowly resumed. That may not sound extraordinary, but for millions of Britons, normality itself had become extraordinary. The war had disrupted nearly every aspect of life. Families had been separated. Homes had been destroyed. Entire communities had been uprooted. The prefab estates offered something many people had not experienced in years. Stability. And stability changes people. The children who grew up in these neighborhoods would later remember them with a level of affection that often surprised historians. Many expected former residents to describe prefabs as inferior housing. Temporary solutions. Cheap government structures. Instead, interviews repeatedly revealed something else. Nostalgia. Deep nostalgia. Ask former residents about leaking roofs decades later, and many would acknowledge the problems. Then they would immediately start talking about the gardens. The neighbors. The freedom. The sense that everyone knew everyone. One former resident described it simply. It wasn't the house. It was the life. That distinction matters. Because by the standards of architecture, the prefabs were never remarkable. Their significance came from the lives unfolding inside them. Every estate developed its own routines. Children played football in open spaces between houses. Families shared tools and gardening equipment. Neighbors watched one another's children. Doors were often left unlocked. People borrowed sugar, tea, or milk from the house next door. It was not a perfect world. Arguments happened. Disputes emerged. But there was also a strong sense of mutual dependence. Many residents had arrived at roughly the same time. Many were young families. Many were trying to rebuild their lives from scratch. That shared experience created bonds that proved surprisingly durable. And nowhere was this more visible than among the generation of children raised there. For them, the prefab estates were not temporary housing. They were simply home. A child born in a prefab in 1948 might spend an entire childhood there. Learn to walk there. Celebrate birthdays there. Leave for school every morning from the same front door. By the time government officials spoke about replacing the structures, many residents had accumulated decades of memories inside walls that were supposedly temporary. The houses themselves contained features that helped reinforce this attachment. Unlike many urban apartments of the period, prefabs often included private gardens. That seemingly small detail had enormous consequences. Families grew vegetables. Children built play areas. Parents created flower beds. The outdoor space became an extension of the home itself. For people who had endured wartime shortages, gardens offered more than recreation. They offered independence. Some families supplemented their food supply with vegetables grown in their own backyards. Others simply enjoyed the rare luxury of having space. Space was one of the defining characteristics residents remembered. Not vast space, but enough. Enough room for children to play. Enough room for privacy. Enough room to breathe. The irony was difficult to ignore. These temporary bungalows often felt more comfortable than many permanent homes built before the war. Government officials continued describing them as short-term solutions. Residents increasingly disagreed. Then there was the community itself. Because the prefabs did something unusual. They concentrated people at nearly identical stages of life. Young couples. Young parents. Young families. Entire neighborhoods seemed to age together. Children attended school together. Parents grew older together. Families celebrated weddings, births, and holidays together. Over time, these estates developed identities of their own. Visitors often noticed how tightly connected the communities appeared. The houses may have been mass-produced. The neighborhoods were anything but. Every street accumulated its own traditions, personalities, and stories. By the mid-1950s, government planners faced an unexpected reality. The housing crisis had not disappeared. Permanent housing construction continued. But the prefabs remained heavily occupied. More importantly, many residents did not want to leave. The structures were exceeding expectations. The 10-year lifespan originally envisioned by engineers was approaching. Yet most of the houses remained standing. Families continued living in them. Children continued growing up in them. Communities continued thriving within them. The temporary solution was becoming surprisingly permanent. And that created a new problem. Because while residents were building lives inside these homes, time was quietly working against the buildings themselves. Metal components aged. Weather took its toll. Maintenance costs increased. Engineers began issuing warnings. The houses were lasting longer than expected. But not forever. Sooner or later, Britain would have to decide what to do with the homes that had sheltered an entire generation. And when that moment arrived, many families would discover that losing a prefab felt far more painful than anyone in government had ever imagined.